You never expect your life to shift while standing in the middle of someone else's driveway, soaked in sweat and dust from hours of power washing old grime off concrete. But that's exactly where it happened for me. I didn't go there looking for connection or anything beyond a decent paycheck and a quick job. But sometimes, the people you meet in the most ordinary circumstances end up changing everything, especially when one quiet moment reveals just how alone someone has been for far too long. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Her name was Camila, and she lived at the end of a long, curving cul-de-sac shaded by trees that always seemed a little too tall for the suburban houses beneath them. I remember the way the leaves swayed gently in the mid-morning breeze as I parked my van along the curb. And it was the kind of neighborhood where everything looked maintained but not quite loved, where hedges were trimmed but not flourishing, and mailboxes leaned just a bit too far forward from years of being nudged by delivery drivers who didn't care. It was quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful, more like the kind of silence that fills a space when it hasn't been disturbed in too long. Camila had reached out through a local maintenance referral group. Her message was brief. Driveway needs power washing. Stains haven't come out for years. We'll pay cash. No emojis. No pleasantries. Just the facts. That kind of tone used to put me off. But over the years, I'd learned it was often a sign of someone just trying to keep things simple, probably because life had been complicated for too long. When I knocked on the door, it opened slowly. She peeked through first before opening fully, like she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to let someone in. She was tall, maybe a little over 5'8", with dark chestnut hair pulled into a loose braid over one shoulder. Her features were soft but tired under-eye circles that spoke of more than just bad sleep. A posture that looked like it had been carrying invisible weight for decades. She wore an oversized flannel shirt over a faded tank top, denim shorts, and no shoes. Her toenails were painted a chipped pale pink. She looked at me like she was trying to place me somewhere she'd never been, then gestured toward the driveway without a word. I gave her a polite nod and got to work. That's how most jobs started anyway, quiet, transactional, quick. I wasn't one to pry. I'd been hired for a task, not a conversation. But something about Camila felt brittle. Like she wasn't just trying to keep her house clean. She was trying to keep her world from falling apart. The driveway wasn't in terrible shape, but there were stubborn oil stains near the garage and dark moss creeping in from the edges. As I unrolled my hose and fired up the machine, I caught her watching from the window with her arms crossed. It wasn't suspicion, not exactly. It was more like she didn't know what else to do with her day besides stand there and observe that one new thing happening outside her door. I focused on the grime. It's working slowly, letting the roar of the water do the talking. That's one thing I liked about power washing. It was loud enough to drown out small talk. And most clients didn't want to linger around anyway. But this time she stayed. I noticed the curtain shift every so often as she changed angles. And after about 30 minutes, she stepped out onto the porch with a glass of lemonade. She didn't say anything, just held it out like an offering. I turned off the machine, took the glass, and thanked her. She nodded, then said the first thing all day that wasn't typed through a screen. "I'm 51, she said quietly, her voice nearly lost in the sound of distant wind chimes, and I don't know how to be alone. It was so sudden, so startling, that I almost dropped the glass. I didn't know her, didn't even know her last name yet. But there she was, confessing the kind of thing most people would only share with a therapist or maybe a lifelong friend. Not a guy holding a water hose. She stood there for a second, probably realizing how much she had just revealed, and then she offered a half smile like she was embarrassed. I wanted to say something comforting, or at least neutral, but nothing came out right. Instead, I just nodded and said, "That's a hard thing to say." She looked down at her bare feet and said, "Yeah, it was." Then she turned and walked back inside, closing the door gently behind her. I stood there on her driveway, hose dripping quietly in my hand, knowing, without question, that this was going to be more than just another job. From that moment on, the energy between us shifted. She wasn't just a client anymore. She was a woman standing at the edge of something she didn't yet have the words for. And I was the stranger who happened to arrive the same week her silence got too heavy to hold alone, the machine hissed. Back to life with the push of a button, and as the high-pressure water carved lines of clean through layers of old dust and algae, I tried to push Camilla's words out of my head, but they clung to me. Clung like the sweat to the back of my neck, like the sunburn already beginning to form on my forearms. I'm 51, and I don't know how to be alone. That sentence didn't just come from a place of temporary sadness. It came from the kind of truth people avoid saying out loud because once it's spoken, it echoes too loudly to ignore. I kept my eyes on the concrete. My thoughts kept straying to the woman behind the door. I'd worked in a lot of neighborhoods like this, for people from all walks of life, retired couples, working parents, newly divorced folks, recent widows. You learn to read the signs over time, the silences, the way certain houses don't have music playing anymore, or how some porches gather dust that no one bothers to sweep off. Camilla's place wasn't messy. It was tidy, but tired, like it had been frozen in time just after someone left. I finished the first section of the driveway and took a short break, standing in the sliver of shade cast by her garage. The sun was beginning to tip past noon, the heat coming in thicker waves now. I drank the last of the lemonade she'd given me earlier, the taste still tangy on my tongue, and leaned on the edge of the van to stretch my legs. I could hear movement. Inside the house, footsteps, maybe a chair dragging. And then music. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. A jazz record. Maybe something older, Miles Davis or Chet Baker. Slow. It's longing. The kind of music that wandered through a house like it was looking for company. I smiled without meaning to. Music like that wasn't background noise. It was emotional. Wallpaper. It meant someone was trying to feel something again. A few minutes later, she came out again. This time in sandals, her braid now undone and resting around her shoulders. She had changed shirts too now, wearing a loose linen top, pale blue, almost seafoam green, in the sunlight. She brought out a book and sat on the porch, just far enough away not to intrude, but close enough that her presence filled the air. Like a question mark. I resumed work. She didn't say anything at first, and I didn't press her. But after 20 minutes or so, she lowered the book and asked, "Do you enjoy this work?" It caught me off guard. Not because of the question, but because she asked it like she genuinely wanted to know, not just as a form of small talk. I shut off the machine again. "It's not glamorous," I said, wiping sweat from my brow, "but there's something satisfying about watching things get clean. You see the progress instantly, not like most things in life." She nodded, and then, after a pause, said, "My husband used to say that about mowing the lawn. He liked seeing clean lines. Something he could control." That was the first time she mentioned him. The air got heavier, not sad, just denser with history. I didn't ask more. She seemed grateful for that. We stood there in silence again around the porch, me beside my machine, until she said softly, "He left 2 years ago. It wasn't dramatic. Just woke up one day and said he didn't love me anymore." There it was. The crack in the foundation. I don't know why people tell me things like that. Maybe it's because I'm quiet. Maybe because I look like I'll listen and not judge. Or maybe it's because when you're broken in a place people can't see, and someone shows up without knowing your past, you feel a strange urge to hand them pieces of it to see if they'll hold it gently. I didn't say anything grand or profound. Just nodded, and I think that was enough. Sometimes you don't need advice, just acknowledgement. "I didn't know what to do," she continued, "so I didn't do anything. I stayed in the house, kept his things. I watered the plants. I played his records. And I thought if I just did all the same things, maybe something would feel normal again." I crouched down and picked up the hose. "Did it?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "No. It just made the silence louder." I worked in silence after that, not out of discomfort, but respect. She had let something out, and it needed room to breathe. She watched me for a while longer before going inside. The music stayed, soft and constant, flowing through the open window like a companion. By the time I finished the second section of the driveway, The sun had dipped behind the roofline, casting the whole area in shadow. I packed up the hose, cleaned off the equipment, and started wrapping up for the day. Samela came out again, this time holding a small envelope. "For today," she said, handing it to me. I know it wasn't all done, but I waved it off. "No rush. I'll be back tomorrow to finish. Just make sure you're home. Don't want to leave the hose lying around again." She nodded. "I'll be here. Same time. Same time." She paused, then added, "Thanks for not acting weird when I said what I said earlier." I gave her a small smile. "Thanks for saying something real." She smiled back, fuller this time. "Good night, Camila." As I drove away, I glanced at my rearview mirror and saw her still standing there, arms folded, watching the driveway, watching the parts of it that were already clean. There was more to this job than water and concrete. I just didn't know yet. How much? The next morning, I arrived just after 10. The air was already thick with heat, promising another long day under the sun. As I parked and stepped out, I noticed something different. Camila's porch had been swept. The mat was repositioned, the potted plants along the steps were watered, and there was a small citronella candle burning beside the doorway. Subtle changes, but meaningful. It looked like a place being lived in, not just endured. She came out before I could knock, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and holding 2 mugs of coffee. I wasn't used to being offered coffee by clients at most. You'd get a nod and a wave, but she handed it to me with that same gentle seriousness she had the day before. I took it grateful. The steam rose in the space between us. "You got an early start," I said. "I figured I'd make the most of today." "I woke up thinking about what we talked about yesterday. Or what I said, I guess," she replied, sitting down on the top step. It felt strange hearing it out loud. I nodded. Sometimes you don't realize how loud something's been living inside you until it slips out. She tilted her head like she was storing that away. We sipped in silence for a while before I got back to work, as the machine roared to life. Again, I slipped into the rhythm of it. Spray, move, sweep, pause. There's something meditative about power washing. The repetition, the noise, the visible results. Every clean streak is proof that something neglected could be restored. About an hour in, I noticed Camila had moved a chair from inside to the porch. She sat with a notebook on her lap, scribbling occasionally, lost in thought. There was something peaceful about her presence now. Not that she was suddenly fixed or glowing with newfound joy, but she seemed more settled, like she was allowing herself to exist a little more openly around noon. I shut the machine off for a break. She looked up and offered a sandwich she had made, ham and cheese on sourdough, wrapped in parchment like it came from a quiet cafe. I accepted it with a grateful nod. We sat on the porch again, side by side, but not touching, watching the cleaned driveway glisten in the sun. "My husband used to talk a lot," she said suddenly. "He had this way of filling space with noise. When he left, the silence felt like a punishment, like I didn't deserve noise anymore." I looked at her. She wasn't crying, just remembering out loud. Maybe silence isn't a punishment. I said, "Maybe it's just waiting for you to stop punishing yourself." She turned her head toward me, surprised. "That's a poetic thing for a guy with a hose to say." I laughed, a full, unguarded sound. "Don't let the hose fool you. I've had my fair share of silence. She didn't ask for details, and I didn't offer them." There was a quiet agreement between us, a kind of mutual respect that didn't demand confession unless the time was right. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That afternoon, we moved to light conversation. She told me she used to work in publishing, mostly behind the scenes, copy editing, layout, contracts. She'd left the job when her marriage became rocky, thinking she could patch things up by being more present. But all it did was make the breakup feel like it had a bigger stage. "I thought staying home would bring us closer," she admitted, "but it just made the distance more obvious." I didn't say much to that. I knew what it felt like to give your best to someone and feel like you were throwing it into a bottomless well. Some truths are shared not because they need answers, but because they've been too heavy to carry alone. As the afternoon waned and shadows lengthened across the driveway, I wrapped up the final section of cleaning, as the entire slab now looked nearly brand new. It was remarkable how just a few hours of focused care could reverse years of neglect. I wondered if people were like that too. Maybe we weren't meant to be fixed all at once, but in parts, carefully, over time, with help. Camila walked with me as I packed up the equipment. She didn't offer to pay just yet, didn't rush the moment. She just stood beside me, quiet, watching the hose coil in neat spirals as I reeled it in. I didn't think I'd enjoy having someone around again, she said, more to herself than to me. I thought it would feel like an intrusion. But this felt different. I looked up at her, wondering where this was going. You don't ask too many questions, she added. I like that. I figure people talk when they're ready, I said. No need to rush it. She nodded, thoughtful. Then, as I shut the van's back doors, she placed a hand gently on the edge of the metal frame. I've got a few more things that need fixing, she said. Nothing urgent, but maybe you could take a look sometime. I smiled. Sure, just let me know. She hesitated a beat longer, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a small key. This is for the side gate, she said, placing it in my hand, in case I'm not home next time. That gesture hit harder than I expected. It wasn't just trust, it was invitation. A way of saying, I'm not ready to be alone all the time anymore. I drove home slower than usual that day. The kind of slow where you notice the shape of the clouds and the way the late sun stretches across the road in golden beams. I felt something shift inside me too. I wasn't falling in love, not yet, but I was falling into something honest. Something unspoken, something real, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. I didn't expect to hear from her the very next morning, but at 8:12 a.m., I got a text. If you're free today. I found a few other things that could use a professional touch. Also, I made blueberry scones. Mila. I stared at the message for a few seconds, feeling the smallest, strangest flutter in my chest. Scones and a side gate key didn't necessarily mean anything romantic, but they meant something, and that something pulled me back to her street, with a kind of anticipation I hadn't felt in a long while. Not nervous, not eager, just curious and a little lighter than the day before when I pulled up. She was already outside, sitting on the porch swing with her legs tucked under her and a mug of tea balanced carefully on the armrest. She was barefoot again. That seemed to be her favorite state, grounded, quite literally. The breeze was picking up, rustling through the trees, and for a moment, everything looked like it belonged in a quiet Sunday morning postcard, except this was Tuesday. She waved with that same soft openness I was starting to recognize, and before I even got to the porch, she handed me a napkin-wrapped scone, still warm. I took a bite as she gestured toward a loose shutter near the garage, and a garden faucet that wouldn't stop dripping. I nodded, sipping coffee from my thermos while she described the issues. But honestly, I was only half listening. The other half of my brain was tuned to the way she moved now, with the weariness from before, but with a kind of tentative presence, like someone slowly thawing after a long winter. As I worked on the shutter, she stayed outside, pruning some neglected plants and occasionally humming to herself. The silence between us was comfortable now, not the heavy, awkward kind, but the kind that came from people who no longer needed to perform. It was refreshing. I couldn't remember the last time I'd worked at a house where someone just let me be without hovering or asking questions about tools or prices. Camila trusted the process, and that trust wasn't lost on me. After a couple of hours, we broke. For lunch, she'd made a salad with grilled chicken, roasted beets, and walnuts. It tasted like something from a restaurant, but she brushed off my compliment, saying I used to cook a lot more, trying to get back into it. It struck me how often we say things like that, trying to get back into it, as if we're constantly circling the person we used to be, unsure how to re-enter our own lives. She told me a bit more about her past, how she and her husband had met in college, how their love had started like a wildfire fast, consuming all bright heat, tanned then slowly. Over decades, reduced itself to embers. It wasn't a dramatic end, she said. It's the strange part. No yelling, no cheating. Just two people waking up and realizing they'd been living side by side instead of together. I listened, chewing slowly, letting her voice fill the gaps between bites and breeze. She didn't cry. She didn't even sound bitter, just tired of pretending that she was fine when clearly she was still building her way back toward anything. Resembling fine, after lunch, we worked in tandem. She helped hold the ladder while I reseated the gutter and handed me tools from the open toolbox as if we'd done this 100 times before. There was a rhythm to our movements, I realized. Then that shared silence during labor was more intimate than most conversations. It's when you trust someone enough not to fill every second with sound that something honest begins to take root. Later in the afternoon, she brought out an old speaker and set it on the porch rail. The playlist surprised me: Fleetwood Mac, Tracy Chapman, Brandi Carlile. Women with strong voices and aching truths. The music blended with the sounds of hammering and scraping and wind, and it made the day feel cinematic in a quiet, lived-in way. Like a scene from a film no one would ever make, but we both somehow knew the plot too. As I finished up with the final repair, Camila disappeared into the house for a few minutes. When she came back, she was holding a small, worn photo album. She handed it to me wordlessly, then sat down on the porch step. I sat beside her and opened it. Inside were photos. From 20, 30 years ago. Weddings, road trips, birthday parties, lazy days on unfamiliar couches. A younger version of her in almost every shot, always mid-laugh or holding someone's hand. Her eyes sparkled in the photos, brighter than they did now, but not by much. They weren't deadened by loss, just softened, like they'd learned. To see differently over time, that's me and Daniel, she said, pointing to a photo of a couple tangled in blankets on a picnic blanket. It was spring. We thought we had all the time in the world. I nodded, unsure if I should ask what had really happened. But I didn't have to. She turned the page and whispered, "Some things just unravel slowly. You don't notice until you're holding the loose thread in your hand and you can't remember how long it's been there." That moment wasn't about pity. It was about presence. She wasn't asking me to solve her grief. She just needed someone to witness it without. Trying to patch it up, we sat for a while, letting the weight of time settle between us like dust in sunlight. She closed the album eventually, gently, and set it on her lap. "You remind me of how simple connection used to be," she said. "Back when just showing up and listening was enough." That sentence hung in the air like a blessing and a warning, all at once. I wanted to ask what she meant by used to be, but I didn't. I didn't want to chase it away. I just let it live in the air with us. As the sun began to dip, she stood and dusted her hands on her jeans. "I think that's enough for today," she said. "You've done more than I expected. Glad to help." She looked at me for a long moment, then added, "You're welcome to come by even when there's nothing to fix." That caught me off guard. It was the first time she'd opened the door to something more than work. A gesture, a suggestion, not quite an invitation, but a breadcrumb on the path. "I might take you up on that," I said. And I meant it. That night, I didn't just sleep well. I dreamed. Of sunlight on porches, of old music, of laughter blooming in spaces where silence used to live. And in the middle of all that, Camila's voice, saying not that she was afraid to be alone, but that maybe, just maybe, she was learning. She didn't have to be anymore. The following days settled into a quiet rhythm neither of us had spoken out loud. I both understood. I didn't hear from Camila immediately, and I didn't expect to, so that wasn't how this worked. She wasn't the type to text frivolously or invent errands just to draw someone near. But when I did get another message 2 days later, it wasn't a request for help with some household task. It was simpler and somehow heavier. "Would you like to come by for coffee? No projects today, just coffee. See?" I stared at the message longer than necessary, reading it again and again, like there was a second layer to it. Maybe there was. Maybe she was testing the waters of something fragile, comfort that didn't come with utility, presence not tied to productivity. When I showed up that Saturday morning, she answered the door barefoot again, in a long navy sweater and leggings, holding 2 steaming mugs. She didn't say hello, just handed me the mug and walked inside like she'd always known I'd follow. The house smelled like cinnamon and something buttery in the oven, and a quiet folk playlist played. From the corner speaker, it struck me, not for the first time, that Camila had built herself a world that was calm, intentional, and deeply private. Letting someone into that world wasn't small. It was everything. We sat in the sunroom that overlooked her small backyard. Both of us curled into chairs with knitted throws tossed over our laps. She told me about the fig tree in the corner, how it never bore fruit, but she kept it anyway because she liked the shape of its leaves. I listened, sipping coffee, content to be the audience of a slow unraveling. I could tell she was thinking about something deeper, chewing over some thought that hadn't yet made it to the surface. I didn't press. Eventually she asked, "Do you ever wonder how your life ended up looking the way it does?" The question hung there between us, not rhetorical but not demanding. I took my time. "Sometimes," I said, "but more often I try to figure out where I stopped asking myself that question." She nodded like she understood exactly what I meant. It's easy to slip into living on autopilot. You wake up one day and realize you've shaped your life, more out of fear than desire. Fear of what? I asked gently. "Fear of being wrong," she said. "Fear of being alone. Fear of hurting someone or being hurt again. So you settle for stillness, for safe decisions, for small, quiet unhappiness instead of the chaos of risking something real." Her voice didn't break, but her eyes did. Shimmered, catching the morning light like thin glass ready to crack. I didn't offer platitudes. I didn't reach across the table. I just stayed with her in that moment, letting her sadness breathe without shame. Later, she brought out a plate of warm muffins, and we fell into softer conversation music. Books, the neighbor's new puppy that kept digging under the fence. But even in that lightness, there was a quiet thread running beneath it all. The sense that something between us had shifted again. We were no longer a homeowner and a handyman with a few shared lunches. We were two people orbiting something delicate and undefined, something that might become a friendship, or maybe something more. Neither of us dared name it yet, but we both felt its gravity. I left after lunch, and as I stepped off the porch, she called after me. "I don't think I've laughed this much in a long time." I turned, smiling. "Then let's make it a habit." Her answering smile was small but radiant, like sunlight catching the edge of a lake. The next few visits blurred into one another, not because they were forgettable, but because they felt seamless. She called when she had a leaky pipe. I stopped. By when I had an extra hour between jobs, she'd bake something new or show me a corner of the house I hadn't seen yet. We talked about nothing and everything, her favorite childhood camping trip. My first job as a dishwasher, the strange loneliness that sometimes creeps in, even when you're surrounded by people. One afternoon, as I was fixing a creaky cabinet, door in her kitchen, she sat on the floor beside me and said, "I think I used to be good at being alone. When I was younger, I'd read for hours, write stories, rearrange my furniture just because I felt like it. But somewhere along the way, I forgot how." "You didn't forget," I said, tightening a hinge. "You just got used to sharing your space, your thoughts, your habits." She looked at me, eyes searching. "But now that it's just me again, I don't know how to re-inhabit this life. It's like wearing clothes that used to fit but don't feel right anymore." Closed the cabinet, sat back, and said, "Maybe it's not about going back to the old clothes. Maybe it's about tailoring new ones." She blinked slowly and then whispered, "You always say the right things." "How do you do that?" "I just say the true things," I replied. She didn't respond, but she didn't need to. Her silence wasn't absence. It was understanding. That evening, as I was about to leave, she stepped out onto the porch with me. The sky was a canvas of burnt orange and indigo. I paused, taking it in. Camila did too, her arms wrapped loosely around herself. Then she said, so quietly I almost missed it, "I'm 51 and don't know how to be alone." It wasn't the first time she'd said it, but it landed differently now. Less like a confession, more like a declaration, raw, unresolved, honest. And in that moment, I realized she wasn't asking for someone to fix it. She wasn't looking for rescue. She was simply saying what was real, letting the truth hang in the air, like breath in cold morning air. I didn't try to fill the silence that followed. I let it settle, sacred and unbroken. Eventually, she turned toward me, offering a faint smile. "You're not what I expected." "Neither are you," I said. And then I left, not because I wanted to, but because it felt like the right time. Some connections need space to breathe, to find their shape. And some moments are too honest to be followed by anything but stillness. As I drove home, I kept hearing her words on a loop. "I'm 51 and don't know how to be alone." But instead of sounding sad, they sounded like the beginning of something. A question waiting for an answer. The door slightly ajar. And maybe, just maybe, I was already on the other side of it. The following week passed with a strange kind of restlessness that I hadn't felt in years. Work carried on as usual, driveways to power wash, gutters to clean, sheds to repair. But Camila's presence hung in the background of my thoughts like a gentle echo. She wasn't consuming my mind in some obsessive way, but rather lingering like a scent on a jacket, collar familiar, unshakable, and comforting in its subtle persistence. I wasn't falling for her, I told myself. Not yet, maybe not at all. But I was becoming tethered to something real, something slow-burning, something I didn't fully understand. It was Thursday when I heard from her again. It's just a simple message. "If you're around tomorrow, I've got an old bench that could use saving. I thought of you." There was a photo attached of a faded, weather-worn wooden bench sitting beneath a gnarled willow tree in the back corner of her yard. The kind of bench that had witnessed time, sorrow, joy, and dozens of quiet afternoons. I stared at the image longer than I should have before replying, "I'll bring my sander and some linseed oil. See you around 10. When I arrived, the morning sun was spilling through the trees, casting long shadows over her yard. Camila met me out back this time, already kneeling beside the bench with a soft cloth in her hand and a determination in her eyes that reminded me of someone trying to rescue a memory. She stood as I approached, brushing dirt from her jeans, and said, "I wasn't sure if you'd come." "You knew I would," I said quietly, and her small smile confirmed it. We worked on the bench for hours. She helped, her hand surprisingly steady as she sanded down rough edges and flaking paint. We didn't talk much, but we didn't need to. There's something sacred about restoring a forgotten object together. You begin to treat it with reverence, as if honoring the time it has already survived. Somewhere between the sanding and staining. She paused, wiped her forehead, and said, "This bench used to sit outside our first apartment. Daniel and I carried it with us every time we moved. It's probably the only thing that's seen every version of us." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and kept working, letting her memory settle between us like sawdust. In the air. Later, when we stepped back to admire our progress, she placed her hand on the wood and whispered, "You can still love what no longer fits." And I felt it again, that shift, that weightless, wordless understanding that we were both carrying more than we let on, but we were beginning to carry it together. After lunch, we sat on the bench, even though the stain was still tacky, ignoring the risk of ruining our jeans. The breeze picked up, rustling the willow branches above us, and for a moment I felt suspended in time. Like the world had folded in on itself, leaving only this corner of the yard, this imperfect bench, the quiet thrum of something new forming. She turned to me suddenly, her voice barely louder than the leaves, and said, "Do you ever wonder what you're supposed to do with the rest of your life?" "Every day," I replied without hesitation. And it was the truth. Camila looked ahead again, her fingers absently tracing the grain of the wood between us. "I used to have a plan. Marriage, kids, a house filled with music and light and noise. But life edits itself, doesn't it? Without your permission. Suddenly there are chapters you didn't write, choices you didn't make, and endings you weren't ready for." I took a breath, the air thick with unspoken stories. Maybe the trick is realizing that we're allowed to start a new draft, that nothing has to be final unless we stop showing up. She glanced at me then, really looked, like she was searching for the root of my words. "You say that like someone who's had to start over?" "I have," I admitted, "not all it. Once, but in pieces. Slowly, painfully. Letting go of who I thought I'd be to make room for who I might become." Her eyes softened, and for a second, I saw her not just as a woman navigating grief, but as someone deeply brave for still trying, still showing up, still inviting light into her quiet spaces. And it made me want to be braver too. The sun dipped lower, and the yard began to glow in that golden hue that only lasts a few fleeting minutes before dusk. Camila leaned back against the bench, her head tilted toward the sky. "This part of the day," she murmured, "always makes me feel like I'm on the edge of something." "You are," I said. "We both are." She looked at me again, her gaze steady but soft. "And what if it doesn't lead anywhere? What if this is just a moment and nothing more?" "Then it's still worth being in," I replied. "Even fleeting things can be real." She nodded, her expression unreadable but full of something I couldn't name. Then, as if the moment had exhausted its depth, she stood, brushing off her jeans. "Come inside." I made lemon bars. Inside, the kitchen was warm and fragrant, and she moved through it with an ease that made me wonder how many nights she'd spent cooking for no one, preparing meals just to remember how it felt to care for someone. We ate at the counter side by side, and when she laughed at one of my stupid stories, I caught myself staring at the lines around her mouth. They weren't just age lines, they were living lines. Lines that marked laughter, grief, survival. When I left that night, the air had cooled and the sky was heavy with stars. Camila walked me to the porch again, the bench barely visible in the shadows behind her. She didn't say anything as I turned to go, but she reached out and touched my arm gently. Just above the wrist. It was the smallest touch, the briefest. But it stayed with me the whole way home, radiating heat through my skin like a brand. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was restless, but because I felt awake in a way I hadn't for years. As if something inside me had finally stretched its limbs after a long, dreamless sleep, and I realized somewhere between midnight and dawn now that I wasn't just showing up to fix things anymore. I was showing up for her. The next few days passed in a blur of mundane tasks and internal distraction. I kept up with work driveways, deck cleanings, a couple of minor repair jobs, but I found myself mentally drifting. Every time I passed a willow tree, or smelled lemon zest, or caught that specific tone of quiet on the radio, my thoughts circled. Back to Camila. It wasn't obsession. It was resonance. A pull. Like a frequency I had suddenly tuned into after years of static. Wasn't trying to name it or shape it or even define what I felt. I just knew that something in me had stirred, something long buried. It wasn't ready to go back into hiding. She didn't text for 3 days, and I didn't reach out either. I think we both understood the rhythm we were building. We gave each other space, but it was the kind that still hummed with presence. I wasn't out of her orbit, and she wasn't out of mine. Then, late on a Tuesday night, my phone lit up with a short message. "Do you like jazz?" I blinked, chuckled to myself, and replied, "Depends on the mood. But I've got a feeling you're about to set it," she responded with a pin drop and a time. A small jazz club tucked away in a corner of town I rarely visited. Friday, 8 p.m. It felt different from all our previous encounters, less like a repair call or an afternoon coffee, and more like something you'd only extend to someone you hoped to know beyond the surface. I spent more time than necessary choosing what to wear. It's nothing too formal, but also nothing that screamed guy who just power washed a porch. I arrived a few minutes early, palms slightly sweaty, heart thudding like I was 25 again. And showing up to a first date? Camila was already there, seated at a small table near the back. Her dress a deep burgundy that seemed to catch the low amber light and reflect it in waves. She looked up as I entered, her smile subtle, but unmistakably warm. There was something softer about her tonight, like she had peeled away a layer of armor, but left just enough intact to keep herself balanced. As I sat down, she leaned in and said, "You clean up well." I smirked, replying, "You say that? Like you expected otherwise." She tilted her head slightly. I wasn't sure what to expect. That's part of the fun, isn't it? The band began to play no lyrics, just instruments weaving emotion into melody. We talked in low voices between the saxophone and upright bass, letting the music fill in the spaces between our thoughts. She told me about her early 20s, When she lived in New Orleans for a year and fell in love with the sound of late-night jazz echoing through narrow streets, I told her about a brief stint I had painting murals in a coastal town, how the silence in my rented studio taught me more about myself than any loud crowd ever could. There was something about that setting, the dim lighting, the honesty. In her eyes, the cadence of the music that made everything feel more vivid, more honest. When she touched my hand briefly to emphasize a point, I didn't pull away. And when she left it there a second longer than necessary, I let the moment breathe. We stayed until closing, neither of us eager to break whatever spell we had stumbled into. Outside, the air was crisp, the streetlights glowing against the wet pavement. She wrapped her coat tighter and said, "I wasn't sure if tonight would feel strange. Like I was trying to be someone I used to be. But it didn't. It felt." She paused. "Natural. Easy." "Maybe that's because you weren't trying," I said. "Maybe you're just being who you are now." She nodded, biting her lower lip, and then asked, "Would it be okay if we didn't go straight back to being practical tomorrow? If we just ... let this be whatever it is right now?" I didn't hesitate. "That's more than okay." And then she surprised me. She stepped closer, not quite into my arms, but close enough that I could feel her breath against my collar. She didn't kiss me. I didn't move to kiss her, but we stood there in silence, our bodies aligned in a quiet, tentative promise. The next day, she texted me a photo of the bench. Now dry and gleaming in the sunlight with a single line beneath it, looks like something worth sitting on with someone. That weekend, we sat on that bench. No tools, no repairs, no jazz clubs, just the two of us, a couple mugs of tea, and the sound of bird song mixing with the wind. We spoke less now, but the silences had deepened into something comforting. Told me about the day she and Daniel bought the house, how they'd imagined raising a family here, hosting dinner parties, maybe even retiring on this very porch. "None of that happened," she said softly, "but I still love the space we made. I just wish I knew how to stop waiting for a future that isn't coming." I looked at her, really looked, and said, "Then maybe it's time to start noticing. The one that is." Her eyes glistened, and for a second, I thought she might cry. But she didn't. She just leaned her head gently against my shoulder and let the moment carry her. That evening, as I packed up my things, she followed me to the gate and said, "You know, I used to believe that anyone who came into my life had to either fix what was broken or fit into the hole someone else left behind. But you're neither. You're just ... here." "I like being here," I told her, and I did. But it wasn't just about liking it. It was about realizing that I had wandered into something fragile and real, something I hadn't even known I needed. Not a new beginning exactly, but a soft continuation. As I walked away that night, I turned back once to see her still standing there, watching me with a look I couldn't quite name. Not longing, not hope, but maybe something in between. And in the silence between us, I could almost hear her whisper again, "I'm 51 and don't know how to be alone." Only now, it didn't sound like a cry for help. It sounded like a truth shared with someone who would stay long enough to understand what it meant. Sunday came with the kind of quiet that made you feel like the world was holding its breath. Had no job scheduled, nothing on my to-do list, and yet I woke up early, instinctively alert. As if some unspoken part of me knew I wouldn't be spending the day alone. I brewed coffee, stood by the kitchen window for a while, and let my mind wander back to Camila, her hands smoothing over the bench. Her voice lost in jazz, the way she said I was just here, as if that somehow was more than enough. And strangely it was. There were no demands between us, no labels, no next steps, pressed forward like expectations. Only an unfolding. A presence that neither of us needed to explain. By mid-morning, the text came in. Short, simple, brunch, no punctuation. Specifics. Just that single word floating on my screen like a leaf drifting across still water. I smiled and typed back, "Omelets or pancakes?" She responded with a photo, fresh strawberries and a colander. Sunlight streaming through her kitchen window, and below it, bring coffee. I packed up a thermos, grabbed a half loaf of sourdough from the local bakery, and drove the familiar road with a quiet eagerness I didn't try to suppress. The air was bright and clean, the last of the morning fog burning off as I turned onto her street. When she opened the door, she looked effortless, hair in a messy twist, a soft gray sweater falling off one shoulder, bare feet on the tile floor. She waved me in without a word, took the thermos from my hands and poured us both a cup like we'd been doing this for years. There was music playing softly, some acoustic guitar track I didn't recognize, and the whole house smelled like something sweet baking, though I didn't see anything in the oven. The familiarity of the scene washed over me like sunlight through a window I didn't know had been there. We weren't in love, not yet, but we were learning each other's rhythm in a way that made love seem like a natural direction rather than a decision, over omelets with goat cheese and roasted tomatoes. She told me about her sister, a woman she hadn't spoken to in months, maybe years, because of a disagreement over their parents' estate. "Isn't it strange," she said between bites, "how the people you know the longest sometimes become the ones who understand you the least?" I nodded, chewing slowly, the taste of rosemary lingering on my tongue. I didn't have siblings, but I understood fracture, understood distance where closeness should have been. I didn't offer advice, just listened, because I knew that sometimes the healing comes not from being told what to do, but from being heard in the quiet moments in between. After brunch, we moved to the backyard. The bench gleamed in the sun, the grain rich and golden. She brought out a blanket and laid it across the grass, and we sat with our backs to the tree, sipping the last of the coffee while birds chirped somewhere high above. "This is what I was afraid of," she said after a long silence.
At being alone. This.
I looked over at her, not quite understanding.
Us.
She clarified, letting someone see me like this, soft, unfinished, not in control. Her honesty caught me off guard. I wanted to tell her how brave she was just for showing up like this, how rare it was to meet someone willing to be fully human in front of another. But instead, I just nodded and let the moment speak for itself. Vulnerability doesn't always need a witness. Sometimes it just needs a place to land. The afternoon drifted by in quiet conversation and longer pauses. She asked about my parents. I told her about my dad's workshop, how he used to carve wooden toys when I was little, and how I still had one of the airplanes he made tucked in a drawer back home. She asked if I ever wanted a family of my own. I hesitated. "I used to," I said. "Still do, maybe, but I stopped chasing the idea of it a while ago. Life's messier than the picture we start with, and sometimes what you build in the mess turns out stronger than what you originally planned." That made her smile in that distant, contemplative way of hers, the kind of smile that meant she was tucking those words away for later like a book she planned to read again. We stayed like that until the shadows grew long and the wind picked up. She walked me to my truck, her arms folded across her chest more out of habit than cold. "Today felt like a memory," she said as I opened the door. "Not the past kind. The kind you know you'll remember when you need it most." I told her I felt the same. And I did. The day was uneventful in the way that makes it precious. A quiet rhythm of shared space, small truths, and no pressure to be anything but present. That night, I sat on my own porch. The stars stretched wide above me, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something else to begin. I was in the middle of something already, not a love story necessarily, not a chapter marked clearly on some calendar, but a series of gentle invitations to stay, to return, to be. Camila didn't need rescuing, and I wasn't looking to be a hero. But somehow we were rescuing something in each other anyway. Through grand gestures, but through the simple act of staying close, of not looking away when things got quiet, of choosing over and over again to return to the same space and find meaning in it. I didn't know what would come next, and neither did she, but we weren't pretending anymore. We were beginning to live inside the question. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that neither of us acknowledged aloud, but both fell into instinctively. There wasn't a schedule, no set plans or routines. But somehow I found myself finishing jobs with more anticipation than usual, checking my phone more often, driving a little slower past Camila's neighborhood, even when I had no reason to be there. She, too, had started texting me without pretense updates about her garden. Photos of oddly shaped clouds, and once, a picture of a half-burnt piece of toast with the caption, "Cooking for one is a disaster. Come save me." We weren't dancing around each other anymore. We were orbiting closer, slowly, carefully, as if neither of us wanted to startle the peace we'd found. One Wednesday afternoon, I was working on a pressure washing job 2 blocks from her place when she texted, "Are you nearby?" I made soup. No pressure. Just, if you're hungry. I hadn't eaten yet. My shirt was soaked through with sweat, and I smelled like a mix of bleach and old wood. But I still found myself wiping my arms with a towel, rinsing my hands at the client's garden spigot, and heading over. Camila greeted me with a towel for my neck and a glass of cold lemonade. She didn't mention my sweat or the trail of water I was probably dripping on her floor. She just gestured to the kitchen and said, "I hope you like lentils." The soup was rich with garlic, cumin, and some spice I couldn't name. We ate it sitting side by side on our porch bench, our knees barely brushing, neither of us speaking. Much, there was no reason to. The silence wasn't empty, it was full of something neither of us dared to put words to yet. After lunch, I helped her bring some boxes down from the attic. She was sorting through old photo albums, searching for a picture of her childhood dog, Jasper. She flipped through page after page, narrating memories as she went, and at one point, she stopped and handed me a picture. It was of her maybe in her late 20s, sitting on a dock with a man beside her. They weren't touching, but their bodies leaned into each other the way people do when they're trying not to make a moment too heavy. "That was Stephen," she said, "not Daniel. Stephen came before. I don't talk about him much." I didn't. "Ask why." "I just waited," she sighed. "He was the first man I thought I'd marry. We were together 6 years. He left one day out of the blue. No affair, no fight. Just said he didn't want to grow old in the same direction anymore." I still think about that phrase. It was so poetic I almost forgave him. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I think that's when I stopped trusting the calm. That sentence sat with me for a long while. I didn't want to respond too quickly. Didn't want to offer some cliche about time healing all wounds or how not every man leaves. So I just said sometimes calm isn't the absence of storms. Sometimes it's 2 people holding still long enough to let the weather pass. She didn't reply. But she closed the photo album and leaned her head on my shoulder, and that was more than what? Enough. That weekend, we didn't see each other. Not because of a fight or distance, but because life simply moved in a different direction. I had 3 jobs lined up back to back, and one of them turned into a full garage cleaning that lasted until midnight. Down. My body aching, I found myself missing her, not just her presence, but the quiet warmth she brought into whatever room she was in. I texted her just before bed. "You were right. Cooking for one sucks." She replied an hour later. "Next time, I'll burn toast for 2. By the following Tuesday, I was back at her house. She'd asked if I could help her repair a loose stair on the front porch, something she could have easily hired anyone to do, but she asked me. When I arrived, she was already outside, wearing a loose denim shirt and gardening gloves, her hair tied up in a messy bun. She had pulled up a couple weeds while waiting and pointed out the spot where the wood had started to rot. As I crouched down to examine the step, she sat on the railing beside me, sipping iced tea and talking about the bird that had built a nest in her mailbox. Her words meandered from there to her favorite childhood books, and then into an anecdote about her father teaching her how to whistle through her fingers. I worked slowly, not because the task was difficult, but because I didn't want the moment to end. When I stood to test the newly fastened stair, she clapped softly. "You really are good with your hands," she said with a playful grin. I laughed, brushing sawdust from my jeans, and replied, "You say that like it's a surprise." She shrugged. "Oh, maybe I'm just surprised how much I like having you around." That's when it shifted. The air between us, already charged with unspoken sentiment, grew heavier. She stepped forward, not too close, just enough that I could see the flicker of something deeper in her eye sphere, maybe. or longing, or both. She exhaled slowly and then said it. I'm 51, and I don't know how to be alone. The words didn't sound like weakness. They sounded like truth. I didn't answer right away. I just looked at her not as someone fragile or lost, but as someone brave enough to speak what most people never do. Finally, I said, maybe you don't have to figure that out today. She nodded, not looking away. We didn't kiss. We didn't even hug. But there was something in the silence that felt like a promise. A mutual understanding that whatever it was, becoming mattered. Enough not to rush. The days following that quiet confession settled into something softer. There was a calm that blanketed our interactions, not forced or manufactured, but something honest, something neither of us tried to explain. Camila didn't bring up her admission again, and I didn't press her about it. It floated between us like a feather, light but persistent, occasionally drifting closer when the moments got too quiet. We resumed our slow dance around intimacy, neither of us trying to define it too quickly, but both of us feeling its gravity increase with every shared glance. Every shoulder brush in the hallway, every meal eaten in the same silence that had once made her feel uncertain and now began to make her feel safe. That week I had a few days off. It was the middle of spring and jobs were slower. Camila invited me to help her reorganize her garage, which she described as the final frontier of chaos. Agreed, though I suspected what she really wanted was an excuse to be near someone. While digging through old memories, the garage was a dusty relic of her previous life. Her cardboard boxes, some collapsed under their own weight, others sealed shut with duct tape and old labels. There were rusted garden tools, faded Christmas decorations, a trunk full of winter clothes, a large pile of books that looked like they hadn't been opened in decades. We started by dragging everything out onto the driveway. The sun was warm on our backs, the air filled with the scent of blooming azaleas and the faint buzz of distant lawnmowers. Camila knelt next to a box labeled Daniel's office, paused, and didn't open it right away. I didn't say anything. After a moment, she looked at me, offered a soft smile, and said, "It's just papers, nothing dangerous." But the way her hands hovered over the tape told another story. When she finally opened the box, it was like cracking open a time capsule. Folders, envelopes, receipts, a broken watch, a few old family photos. She picked up a picture of Daniel in a suit, holding a drink at some party, smiling like he had no idea what life would throw at them. He always wanted everything neat, she said. His desk, his schedule, our future. It was all planned, until it wasn't. She set the photo down gently and moved on. I could see the strength it took to handle those fragments of her past. Without letting them own her, she didn't cry. She didn't look away. She just kept moving. We worked for hours, stopping only for water breaks and quiet exchanges that felt like more than small talk. At one point, I found a box of cassette tapes, each one labeled with years 1989, 1990, 1991. I held one up and she laughed, that low, genuine laugh that made me think of a record spinning on a Sunday morning. Those are my mixtapes. I used to make one every year. Back when that was a thing, I'd sit in my bedroom with a boombox, waiting for the radio to play my favorite songs just so I could hit record at the right moment. She took one from my hand, turning it over in her fingers. "This one," she said, "has Tracy Chapman, The Cure, and about 6 different versions of me trying to sing along badly." She handed it to me and said, "Keep it. If I ever forget who I was, you can remind me." I tucked it into my shirt pocket without saying a word. As the afternoon waned, we sat on the garage step, covered in sweat and dust, sipping cold tea and watching the sun lower behind the neighbor's fence. Camila leaned her head back, eyes closed. "I don't know when the house stopped feeling like home," she said softly. "It used to be full of noise. Family dinners, movie nights, arguments over the thermostat. Then one day it was just me and the quiet." I wanted to tell her that the house wasn't empty, it was waiting, that maybe it had been holding its breath for her to come back to it fully, to give it permission to feel like home again. But instead, I reached out and placed my hand over hers. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. She just let it happen, as if she'd been waiting for someone to choose stillness over spectacle. That night, I went home with the mixtape still in my pocket. I didn't have a way to play it, but somehow, just knowing I had it mattered. It was a piece of her unfiltered, silly, vulnerable, and beautifully hers. I held it in my hand for a long time before placing it on my dresser, next to my keys. Like a keepsake from a chapter still being written, the next morning she texted me a photo of the garage, now organized and clean. Below it, she wrote, It feels like a new room, like it can be something else now. It hit me harder than I expected. We rarely notice when we begin to reclaim pieces of our lives, but that moment, her owning that space again, was one of them. It reminded me of all the places and myself I had abandoned too. All the rooms I had closed off, thinking I'd never need them again. Later that day, stopped by with a portable tape player I found at a thrift store. She blinked in surprise when she opened the door and saw it in my hand. I figured you might want to hear your own voice from 30 years ago, I said. She laughed and pulled me inside. We sat on the floor side by side, listening to her 1991 tape as it crackled through the tiny speakers. The music was fuzzy, warbled in places, but her laughter on the tape, sharp and youthful, cut through it all. There was a moment when the tape caught her singing off-key to Tracy Chapman's Fast Car. She groaned and buried her face in her hands. I can't believe I sound like that, I grinned. I can. It's perfect. She leaned her head against my shoulder again. Familiar now. Unspoken agreement. In the soft lull of music and memory. I felt it. The shift. The fragile, early-forming presence of something real. Something slow, earned, and meaningful. The first time I saw Camila cry, it was so quiet I almost didn't notice it happening. It was a Tuesday evening and we had just returned from an impromptu walk to the farmer's market. She had picked out a bundle of sunflowers, a fresh loaf of sourdough, and a wedge of Gouda, she said, reminded her of her travels through Belgium in her 20s. There had been laughter the whole way, their gentle teasing, stories traded like secrets. She had a way of recounting memories with her whole being, like she was stepping into a separate time and letting me peek through the crack. We walked back slowly, letting the breeze catch our words, letting the day unfold without needing to rush it to any conclusion. Back at her house, we unloaded the goods in her kitchen and began slicing the bread, laying out a simple spread of cheese, grapes, and olives. It was unspoken, but it felt like a celebration of what we didn't say. Maybe just that we'd found something soft in a world that often forgets softness exists. She poured 2 glasses of wine, and we sat on the floor in front of the coffee table instead of the dining room. Plates in our laps, music from an old stereo filling the room. I think it was a Norah Jones track, slow and dusky, at some point. Camila reached for one of the photo frames on the shelf beside her. It was a picture of her and her son Luca from when he was a boy. He looked about 10 in the photo, arms wrapped tightly around her neck, both of them smiling at the camera like the world was a warm, wide place. She stared at the photo for a long time. I said nothing, sensing something shift. She put the frame down slowly, wiped her fingers along the edge like she was brushing away dust that wasn't there. And then her shoulders shook once. Just once, a tremor, like a leaf caught in wind. I looked over and that's when I saw her eyes, red, wet, distant. She didn't sob. There was no wail, no break in her voice, just quiet tears, running steadily as if they'd waited too long to fall. I didn't ask what was wrong. I didn't offer tissues or empty reassurances. I just scooted closer, slowly, and placed my hand over hers. She didn't pull away. If anything, she leaned in. Her head found the space just below my collarbone, and she rested there like someone too tired to hold their own grief upright anymore. After a few minutes, her voice broke through the silence, raspy but firm. She said she missed being someone's person, not romantically, not in the way the world always assumed, but in that quiet, everyday way. Someone to check in with, someone to share grocery lists with, someone to say, "Don't forget your jacket, it looks like rain." She said, even when Daniel was distant, even when the marriage was fading, there was a structure, a framework. And when that goes, it's like forgetting how to stand. That hit me. Not because I'd lived her exact experience, but because I understood the scaffolding we all build to keep ourselves upright: jobs, habits, relationships, and how disorienting it is when they suddenly vanish. I told her gently that learning to be alone wasn't the same as learning to be lonely. That perhaps, in time, solitude could become a sanctuary instead of a punishment. She didn't say anything to that, but she didn't move away either. That night, we sat outside on her back deck, a thin blanket over our legs and a shared mug of chamomile tea between us. The stars were out, scattered like promises we couldn't quite read yet. She pointed out a constellation, Cassiopeia, I think, and shared how her father used to tell her stories about the stars when she was a girl. He'd make up Greek myths, but mess up the endings. So in his version, no one ever died. They all just turned into birds or wandered into the woods and became trees. I smiled at that. It was such a Camila thing to remember the details that softened the sharpness of life. We talked about our childhoods that night, about the things we lost and the things we carried forward, willingly or not. She shared how her mother used to knit, how the smell of lavender still made her think of her grandmother's backyard. I told her about my first dog, Bruno, and the treehouse I built with my uncle that collapsed before I could even climb into it. For hours, we just existed beside each other, story after story stacking like bricks, building something we didn't yet know the name of. Before I left that night, she walked me to the door and said, "Thank you for not fixing me." It caught me off guard. I asked what she meant, and she replied, "Most people rush to solve, to patch the leak, tighten the bolt, erase the pain. But you just let me be messy." I told her maybe that was the point. Not everything broken needed to be repaired. Some things needed space to unravel, to air out, to settle in their new shape. She nodded. Then, with a small laugh, added, "Though if you ever see a leaky faucet, I'd still prefer you fix that." We both laughed, and for a moment, the heaviness lifted. I left that night feeling more than I could explain, with no clear roadmap. For where this was going, only the certainty that it was going somewhere, and that wherever it was, we weren't walking toward it alone anymore. The next morning, I woke to a message from Camila. It was a photo of her breakfast: 2 pieces of slightly burnt toast, scrambled eggs, and a slice of grapefruit. The caption read, "Still figuring out how to cook for one. Might just stick to cheese boards." I smiled and replied, "Next time I'm bringing the coffee. You handle the chaos." We were building something, not defined, not labeled, but undeniably real. By the time Friday rolled around, I found myself timing my days by when I'd see Camila again. The odd thing was, I didn't recognize the shift until I was sitting in my truck after another small job and realized I had driven 10 minutes past my house and was now parked on the edge of her neighborhood. It was like my mind had decided for me that I needed to check in, even if just to catch a glimpse of her porch light glowing, or hear the familiar shuffle of her footsteps behind the door. I didn't knock, not that time. I just turned around and went home. But the weight of the silence in my apartment that night sat heavier than usual. The walls felt too still, the lights too dim. I played her old cassette again, the one with the mixtape, and though it warbled and hissed, the rhythm of her younger voice singing off-key made the place feel a little less hollow. The next day, she called me in the early afternoon. No greeting, just a sigh and a question. "Want to help me pick out a chair?" I laughed and said, "Is that code for something?" And she chuckled back. "Maybe, or maybe I just want to stop sitting in Daniel's old recliner every time I read a book. Feels like I'm wearing his coat." I met her at a vintage furniture shop on the edge of town, a cozy, cluttered place, with mismatched rugs, overgrown ferns hanging from the ceiling, and the faint scent of cedar in the air. The kind of shop where every item had a story and nothing came with instructions. Camila moved through the aisles slowly, running her fingers along fabric patterns, testing cushions, tilting her head as if trying to imagine each piece in her living room. I watched her, admiring how she took her time, not rushing the decision. It wasn't about finding a chair. It was about reclaiming space, about saying, "This is mine now. This is me now." After an hour, she settled on a wide olive-green reading chair with rounded arms and a faded patch on the back corner that looked like it had survived a dozen different lives. "It's imperfect," she said, but it looks like it knows how to stay. We loaded it into my truck, and she sat beside me during the drive home. The wind rolling through the open window, the city drifting past as if we were tucked inside a world entirely our own. Back at her house, I helped carry the chair. Set it near the window where the late sun pooled like honey across the hardwood floor, and adjusted the angle until she gave a small nod. She sat in it with a quiet reverence, curling her legs up beneath her, and smiled. "This feels right," she murmured. "It's not like starting over, more like continuing." I didn't say anything. I just stood there, hands in my pockets, taking. In the sight of her still, content, claiming her place, we made tea. She lit a candle. The late afternoon folded into evening, and she pulled a book from her shelf and began reading aloud. At first I thought it was just for herself, but she kept her voice steady, rhythmic, each word directed just enough toward me that I knew I was meant to hear. It was a poetry collection Rilke. I think. Her voice dipped and rose with the cadence of someone rediscovering a part of themselves they had forgotten they owned. As she read, I watched her, not in the way you watch someone you're trying to figure out, but in the way you watch someone who makes you feel like you've already been figured out. When she finally closed the book, she looked at me and said, "It's strange. I spent years thinking I needed someone to fill the space. But maybe I just needed someone who didn't try to rearrange the furniture." I understood what she meant, and I think she knew that I did. That night, when I left, there was no lingering tension, no expectation in the air. It's just a mutual understanding. We were walking side by side in whatever this was, and we were doing it at a pace that honored the steps. Behind us, as much as the path ahead, Sunday morning brought rain, not a drizzle, but the kind of rain that feels like it's washing the entire town clean. I texted her, asking if she wanted company, and she responded simply, "Yes, bring something cozy." I showed up with 2 oversized hoodies and a bag of cinnamon rolls. She greeted me barefoot, her hair tied back, a grin on her face that made me wonder if this was the beginning of something that neither of us would dare to name yet. We spent the day indoors, windows fogged, the sound of rainfall wrapping around the house like a lullaby. She played old jazz records while I fixed a loose door hinge in the laundry room. At one point I caught her dancing a little, swaying too. The soft brass lost in the music and unaware of my watching. It was a kind of intimacy that words would have ruined. We sat on the floor again, the green chair now proudly positioned behind her, and watched the rain. She leaned her head against my shoulder, and we didn't speak for what felt like hours. At some point, she whispered, "I don't feel alone today." I looked at her and nodded, not trusting my voice, because the truth was neither did I. When I left that evening, she walked me to the porch, the rain now just a soft mist. She took my hand, not an accident, not a casual brush, but a quiet choice, and held it for a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you," she said. "Letting this be slow, for not trying to fix the weather." I smiled. "It's better when you just watch it together." She nodded, her eyes shining with something that looked like peace. I drove home with the window cracked just enough to smell the rain. The cassette tape was still in my glove compartment, but I didn't need it that night, her voice present. Warm Certain was already playing on repeat in my head. The next week passed like the slow turn of autumn quiet, unassuming and full of moments that didn't feel like much at first, but lingered longer than expected. I had a few jobs out of town, so I wasn't around Camila's place as much, but even when I was an hour or two away, she was somewhere in the back of my thoughts. I'd drive past diners or hardware stores and think of a line she'd said, a song she hummed, the way her face softened when she was thinking about something fond from the past. We weren't a couple. We hadn't kissed, hadn't crossed any lines, but somehow it felt more intimate than most of the relationships I'd had before. There was something fragile and real about what we were building like it didn't need to be labeled to matter, it just needed to be respected. On Wednesday evening, she called. I was tired from a long day hauling equipment at a barn restoration site, but her name lighting up on my screen made my exhaustion take a back seat. She said she'd had a rough day, something about a call from her ex-husband that threw her off. He'd wanted to check in on Luca, even though Luca was 21 now and living his own life. Camila didn't like when Daniel pretended concern after long stretches of silence. Right. It's like he's keeping a foot in the doorway, just in case he ever wants to walk back in, she said, voice tight. And the worst part is, a part of me still wants him to care, even if I don't want him back. I understood that kind of emotional muscle memory, the way old love could echo in your bones long after it stopped being good for you. I offered to come over. She said yes, but there was a hesitance in her tone, not because she didn't want company, but because she didn't want to fall apart in front of someone again. Still, when I arrived, she opened the door like she'd been waiting for someone to give her permission to stop pretending she was fine. We didn't say much. She poured 2 glasses of wine, and we sat in the kitchen, the warm glow of the under cabinet, lights casting a gentle halo across the granite countertop. She told me about the early years with Daniel, how he used to cook barefoot and always played, Springsteen while making Sunday breakfast, how he proposed at a rest stop on the way to Oregon, how he used to leave notes in her books, folded between the pages like bookmarks of a love story, and how slowly over time those notes stopped appearing. She wasn't bitter. That surprised me. Most people I knew who were burned by love carried it like shrapnel. But Camila had mourned the relationship already years before the divorce papers were signed. What hurt her now wasn't the ending, but the silence that followed. The absence of something she once shaped her whole life around. She said, "It's not that I miss him. I miss the version of me who believed love like that would last forever." That night, we fell asleep on her living room couch. Nothing happened, not even the brush of lips or a wandering hand. Just 2 people, emotionally threadbare, finding rest in proximity. I woke up first. Her head was tucked into the crook of my shoulder, her breath steady, her hand resting lightly against my chest like she drifted there on instinct. I didn't move. I just let the quiet cradle us both. When she stirred, she didn't recoil or apologize. She looked up at me, her eyes still heavy with sleep, and whispered, "Thank you for being the kind of man who doesn't need to be told where the line is." I smiled. "You deserve peace, Camila. Not just comfort, but peace." She nodded. And that morning, instead of coffee, we made fresh juice and talked about small things: her favorite color, when she was 10, lime green. The name of her first pet, a turtle named Marshmallow. How she once stole a pair of earrings from a department store at 16 and returned them the next day. Riddled with guilt, that moment was the real shift. Not the night we shared the couch, not the long talks or the tears or the green chair, but that morning when she let me see the ordinary, quiet layers of who she was. No performance, no past looming over her shoulder. Just Camila, with grapefruit pulp on her fingers, laughing at how she used to think 30 was old. We were more than strangers now, more than just neighbors or acquaintances. We were becoming something that wasn't quick or loud, but rooted. Later, that week I came by to fix a loose shingle on her roof. She had insisted I didn't have to, that she could call someone else, but her voice gave her away. She wanted me there, and I wanted to be there. After I finished, we sat on the steps, sharing a small bowl of watermelon slices. A neighborhood kid biked past and waved at her like she was his favorite aunt. She waved back and said, "I used to be scared of being seen like this. Alone, divorced, 51, and in between things. Now, I think there's something quietly dignified about starting again." I nodded. "You're not in between things. You're exactly where you're meant to be." She looked at me, her expression unreadable, and said, "Do you think everyone gets this?" A second chapter. I didn't answer right away, because I didn't know, but I said, "Maybe not, but the ones who do usually earn it." She didn't speak again for a while, just leaned against my arm, her presence soft and steady, and in that silence, I felt it. Whatever was forming between us, it didn't need loud declarations or burning passion. It needed truth and time, and the courage to let it be what it needed to become. By the time the following weekend arrived, Camila had officially woven herself into the fabric of my days. It wasn't just that I heard her voice in my head sometimes when I passed an old bookstore or saw a flower stand by the roadside. It was more that I no longer tried to resist the way her presence lingered in the quieter parts of my life. It didn't feel like an intrusion. It felt like a gentle shift in gravity, something I could lean toward without falling. On Saturday morning, she called just to say she was driving out to the farmer's market and asked if I wanted to join. Her tone was casual, but I knew her well enough now to hear the anticipation behind her words. I met her by the entrance. She wore a soft denim jacket and a light scarf knotted at her neck. Her sunglasses perched on top of her head like she'd forgotten they were there. There was something disarmingly charming about how at ease she looked, her arms filled with fresh herbs, a basket swinging from her elbow, eyes scanning stalls, not for necessity, but for the joy of the search. We walked together through the rows of vendors, stopping to sample honey, inspect handmade pottery, and exchange banter with the regulars. It was as if she belonged to this place, like the rhythm of the morning had tuned itself to her. At one stall, she held up a jar of spiced apricot jam and said it reminded her of her grandmother's pantry. Without thinking, I bought 2 jars, one for her, one for me. She raised an eyebrow and said, "You're dangerously good at making ordinary things feel like traditions." I laughed and said, "Maybe we just needed a reason to invent new ones." She smiled and looped her arm through mine, and we continued on like that. 2 people meandering through sunlight and conversation. We ended up back at her place with a bag full of bread, fruit, and fresh cheese. She laid everything out on the back porch table like a picnic and added 2 mismatched mugs of coffee, steam rising lazily as the late morning air warmed around us. We talked about her dreams, real dreams, the kind that come at night and leave you confused in the morning. She told me she'd been dreaming about a house with no doors. Every time she tried to leave, another room opened instead. I asked her what she thought it meant, and she said, "Maybe it's my mind's way of saying I'm still not ready. That even when I think I'm heading for the exit, I'm still choosing to stay." I didn't pretend to be an expert in dreams, but I told her I thought it made sense. Healing, after all, wasn't linear. It was full of detours and repetitions and moments of stillness that sometimes looked like stagnation but were really just quiet preparation. That afternoon, we worked together in her garden. I pulled weeds while she repotted a lavender plant, humming under her breath. The sunlight caught strands of gray in her hair, and she brushed them back without apology. She said, "There was a time I would have dyed these every 2 weeks. I kind of like them." I looked at her, really looked, and told her, "They suit you, like silver threads in a story that's still being written." She laughed, but I saw the way her eyes shimmered just a bit, not because of the compliment, but because I meant it. After we cleaned up, she asked if I wanted to stay for dinner. We didn't cook anything elaborate, just warmed some soup, sliced the fresh bread, and shared a bowl of strawberries for dessert. It was simple, comfortable like slipping into a favorite sweater. We sat on the couch again, this time with a soft throw blanket over our knees. And she played some old folk records on the turntable she dusted off from her storage closet. The crackle of the vinyl and the tremble of the guitar strings created an atmosphere that felt more intimate than candlelight. As the music played, Camila grew quiet. I watched her hands, how they rested in her lap, fingers laced together like she was holding something in. Finally, she said, "I spent so many years afraid of being invisible, of becoming one of those women people stop noticing. And then I realized I was more afraid of being seen and not liked for who I really am." I reached for her hand and held it not with urgency or expectation, but with the calm that comes from knowing the gesture would be welcomed. "You're not invisible," I said. "You never were. And anyone who doesn't see your worth probably isn't looking with the right kind of eyes." She nodded, her fingers tightening around mine. It wasn't a declaration of love, not yet, but it was something close. That night, as I was getting ready to leave, she walked me to the door again, just like she always did. But this time, she didn't let go of my hand immediately. She stood there, studying my face like it held an answer to a question she hadn't yet asked. Then, in a soft voice, she said, "Can I tell you something without you thinking it changes everything?" I nodded, bracing myself. She looked away briefly, then back at me. When the house is quiet and the world has slowed down, I still wait for a key to turn in the front door that I know won't come. It's not about wanting him back. It's about unlearning the shape of his absence. I let her words settle between us before responding. Maybe we don't need to unlearn the past. Maybe we just need to make new rhythms so the echoes don't feel so loud. She blinked at me, and for a moment her eyes filled with something like hope. Then she leaned forward and pressed a kiss to my cheek. Not romantic, not chaste, just real. A gesture that said, "Thank you for not rushing this. Thank you for letting me feel what I feel." I walked to my truck under a sky blooming with stars. The night air was cool, but I didn't feel it. I drove home slowly, the road stretching ahead of me, wide and open. And I knew whatever this was, whatever we were growing it, was becoming something worth protecting. Not because it was fragile, but because it was honest. The week that followed took on a rhythm I hadn't expected, but found myself embracing more with each passing day. It wasn't just about the moments Camila and I shared, but the space she left when we weren't together, an absence that didn't feel like a void, but more like a presence of its own, subtle and calming. I would go about my work replacing shutters for a retired couple in Westfield, repairing siding at a duplex closer to the edge of town, and find my mind drifting to her porch, her laugh, the way she paused before saying something vulnerable, as if tasting the thought before letting it out into the world. And yet, despite the growing pull I felt toward her, I was careful not to press. I knew from experience that some wounds, especially the ones that never bled, took the longest to close. It was Thursday when she called, not with an emergency or a request, just a quiet, "Hey, what are you up to later?" tone that told me she didn't want to be alone that evening. I had no plans, and even if I did, I'd have cleared them. When I arrived at her house, she was barefoot, wearing soft linen pants and a cardigan that hung a little off her shoulder. Her hair was pulled back loosely, and she looked at me like she was relieved just to see a familiar face. There wasn't a dramatic smile or enthusiastic greeting, just a quiet kind of gratitude that said, "I'm glad it's you." We sat on her back deck, the sun beginning to set behind the tops of the oak trees. The breeze was gentle, tugging at the edge of the throw blanket we shared. She had poured us each a glass of wine, and the table beside us held a small bowl of candied pecans and slices of green apple. I noticed she had placed a small stack of notebooks beside her chair, their corners worn and the pages slightly curled. She followed my gaze and said, "Old journals. I've been trying to figure out if I should read them or toss them." I asked if they were painful. She shrugged. "Some are, some aren't. But mostly, they just remind me of who I was when I thought I had everything figured out." There was a silence that settled comfortably between us, not awkward, but thoughtful. I leaned back in my chair, watching the shadows shift across the deck, and said, "I don't think it's about figuring it all out. I think it's about learning how to live with the parts that don't make sense yet." She smiled at that, and I could tell she was filing the thought away. The way she did with words that felt like truth. As night fell, she lit a few candles in glass jars, their soft glow dancing across her face. We didn't talk much for a while. The music playing from the portable speaker was quiet and nostalgic. Joni Mitchell, James Taylor, Simon, and Garfunkel. It suited the moment perfectly, a soundtrack for two people who were learning the art of simply being. Eventually she turned to me and said, "Can I ask you something?" I nodded. She looked down at her wine, swirled it gently, then met my gaze. "Do you think it's possible to fall in love again? After you've already done it once, fully, completely, and had it fall apart?" I took my time before answering. "I think love doesn't have to look the same to be real. Just because it's quieter or slower or built differently doesn't make it any less honest. And sometimes it's even more lasting because of the lessons that came before." She was quiet again, and I could see her absorbing the words. Finally, she said, "I think I'm scared that if I open myself up again, I'll break in places I've only just learned to hold together." I reached over, not to take her hand this time, but to gently tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Maybe the right kind of love isn't one that risks breaking you again, but one that holds all the broken parts and calls them beautiful. That night, I didn't sleep on her couch. I didn't stay at all. We both knew the moment was delicate, and while there was a deepening between us, it wasn't time yet. She walked me to the door, gave me a long look, one that spoke of trust, of gratitude, of something waiting just beneath the surface, and I kissed her cheek, slow and deliberate.
Ow.
She closed the door softly after I left, and for the first time in a long while I felt a kind of ache that wasn't painful. It was tender. It was full of hope. The following day I found myself at a nursery on the outskirts of town. I wasn't sure what drew me there, only that I had the urge to bring something living, something new into Camila's world. I ended up buying a small potted olive tree. It was young, resilient looking, its branches slender and full of promise. When I brought it to her the next day, she blinked in surprise. "What's this for?" she asked, brushing her fingers across the delicate leaves. "Something to take care of," I said. "Something that grows slow but lasts." She smiled, and I could see something stir in her eyes. "That's unexpectedly beautiful," she whispered. We planted it together in a large ceramic pot on the porch. She insisted on naming it. "Let's call her Vida," she said, Spanish for life. It suited the moment, the season, the both of us. Later that evening, while the sun cast long golden rays through her windows and the scent of lavender drifted in from the garden, Camila turned to me and said, "You know what's strange? Don't feel like I'm afraid of being alone anymore." I looked at her, eyebrows raised slightly. "No." She shook her head. "No. Not because I've learned how to be alone, but because being with you doesn't make me feel dependent. It just makes me feel better." That, I realized, might have been the most honest thing either of us had said all week. The days that followed were marked by a quiet steadiness, the kind that settles in not with fireworks or dramatic declarations, but with soft glances and easy routines. Camila and I didn't talk every day, but when we did, it never felt like we were catching up. It just felt like we were continuing. Would get a picture message of the olive tree with the simple caption, "Vida is thriving," or she'd send a voice note describing the way the light hit her kitchen counter that morning, like it meant something more than just sunlight. I found myself keeping those messages, listening to her voice when my day grew heavy. Not because I needed reassurance, but because her presence, even digitally, had become grounding. One Friday evening, she invited me over for dinner, but this time she said, "I want to cook for you." Her voice had a certain confidence, not boastful, but warm, the kind of tone that hinted at intention. When I arrived, she was in the kitchen, apron tied around her waist, sleeves rolled up, hair clipped back. There was jazz playing low in the background, something classic and sultry that wrapped around the room like velvet. The table was already set candles, linen napkins, wine glasses with delicate stems, and the air smelled like roasted garlic and something gently spiced. I offered to help, but she waved me off and said, "Tonight, just sit. Let me take care of this." So I sat, watched her move around the kitchen with a calm efficiency. And for a moment, I felt like I'd stepped into a life that had always been waiting for me. She served pasta with grilled vegetables and a tomato basil sauce made from scratch. We clinked glasses and toasted to nothing in particular, and it struck me that sometimes the best celebrations are the ones that don't need a reason. Over dinner, our conversation drifted to childhood memories. She told me about summers in Santa Fe with her cousins, the way they'd climb fig trees and sneak into outdoor concerts at night. I told her about my uncle's old farm in Wyoming, how the air smelled like hay and diesel, and how I learned to drive a tractor before I could ride a bike properly. There was laughter, a few shared silences, and a lot of eye contact that didn't feel intrusive, just present. After we cleared the table, she put on a record and extended a hand. "Dance with me?" she asked, and without hesitation, I took her hand and pulled her close. The music was slow, and so were we. I placed one hand at her waist and let the other intertwine with hers. Her head rested gently on my shoulder, and for several minutes the world shrank to just that soft rhythm, candlelight, and the quiet understanding between two people who had outgrown the need for pretense. At one point during the dance, She looked up at me, her expression more serious than before. "I need to ask you something," she said. I nodded, giving her space. She took a breath, steady but careful, and said, "What are we doing, really?" It wasn't a question laced with desperation or fear. It was honest. And she deserved an honest answer. I took a moment, let my eyes find hers again. "We're building something," I said, slowly, intentionally. "Something real. I don't know where it's going yet, but I know that wherever it is, I want it to be with you." Her eyes softened then, and she leaned in and kissed Manat. Tentative. Not dramatic, but meaningful. A kiss that wasn't asking a question or trying to convince either of us of anything. It was an answer all its own. Later, as we sat on the couch, her feet tucked under her, she picked up one of the journals she'd left out before. "I read one today," she said. It was from the year after my divorce, full of anger, full of confusion, but also full of hope. Like I was trying to convince myself I still had a life to live, even if I didn't know what it looked like. I asked her if reading it helped. She nodded. It made me realize how far I've come, but also how much I was still holding back. I didn't press her to explain. Some admissions just need to hang in the air for a while before they're ready to land. Instead, I reached out and placed my hand on hers. She looked down at it, then back at me. "I don't want to hold back anymore," she said quietly. "But I'm still learning how not to." I squeezed her hand gently, and "Let's learn together," I said, "one step at a time." She smiled then, and it was different, less guarded, more open. She stood and went to the kitchen, returning a moment later with a small box. "I was going to wait," she said, "but I think tonight is right." She opened the box and pulled out a set of spare keys. "For emergencies," she said quickly, as if she didn't want to overwhelm the moment. Or, not emergencies. I took the keys, held them carefully in my palm. "Thank you," I said. "I'll take good care of them." We both knew the keys weren't just for doors, they were a symbol, an invitation, choice. That night, as I left her house with the keys in my pocket, I didn't feel like a guest anymore. I felt like someone returning home from somewhere I didn't even know I'd been. The stars overhead were brilliant, the night air cool against my skin, but I was warm all over. And somewhere deep in my chest, I felt something bloom quiet, steady and impossible to ignore. Whatever we were building, it was real. And it was just beginning. The days that followed felt like chapters written in softer ink. Nothing loud or dramatic, just quietly profound. Camila and I didn't label what we had, and that felt intentional. We existed in this slow-burning space, between what was and what might be, honoring the truth that healing doesn't always come with declarations. It comes with presence, with laughter over spilled coffee, with shared silence that feels more like conversation than words ever could. It shows up when someone remembers the kind of tea you like, or notices when you're withdrawing before you even do. That was what began to define us, not fireworks, but something deeper, something steady. I had started a new project to Towns, over a fixer-upper cottage belonging to an older couple who reminded me of what Camila and I might look like someday, if we got the chance. They bickered over wallpaper and shared long glances when they thought I wasn't looking. Their home was full of small compromises, his chair in the corner with the footrest she thought was hideous, her quilt collection stacked in baskets he always tripped over. But none of it felt contentious. It felt lived in, real. That's what I wanted with Camilla, something not built in haste or fear, but something worn in gently, like a favorite sweatshirt. Each evening after work, I'd text her something simple. How her olive tree was doing, a quote from a podcast I thought she'd like, a picture of the dog from the cottage who'd taken a shine to me. She'd send me a song recommendation in return, or a photo of the moon from her porch. We didn't talk all day. We didn't have to. But each message was a thread, weaving a quiet kind of intimacy that felt effortless and earned. Then came the Saturday that felt different. Camila called me mid-morning, her voice a little breathless, a little unsure. "Can you come over?" Asked, "I just today feels heavy." I told her I'd be there in 20 minutes, and I meant it. When I arrived, she was sitting on the porch steps, barefoot, wrapped in one of those soft cardigans she always wore when the weather was in between. Her eyes were puffy, like she'd cried and hadn't tried to hide it. I sat beside her without saying anything, just close enough that our shoulders touched. After a few minutes of quiet, she said, "It's my wedding anniversary today," or would have been. I stayed quiet, knowing this wasn't a moment for problem-solving or silver linings. Just listening. She pulled her knees up to her chest, her voice low. "It's been 5 years. You'd think it'd be easier by now, right? But grief's not linear. That's what the therapist says." She gave a half smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Today I woke up and remembered how I used to make breakfast on this day. French toast, his favorite. We'd sit here just like this and talk about where we were 5 years ago, 10. I thought we had time." Her voice cracked, and I reached over, gently taking her hand. "You're allowed to miss him," I said. "Even now, especially now. You don't have to edit your grief for anyone, not even me." She looked at me. Then, and I saw the rawness in her eyes. "But I'm also scared," she admitted. "Because what I feel with you, it's not a rebound. It's not nostalgia. It's something real. It terrifies me that I could lose again. That maybe I don't know how to love in a way that won't hurt." Squeezed her hand. "It's okay to be scared. But maybe being brave doesn't mean you're not afraid. It just means you keep showing up anyway." She leaned into me then, resting her head on my shoulder, and we sat like that for a long time, letting the silence speak. The breeze moved through the trees. The olive tree's leaves shimmered in the sun. And the moment felt like a turning point, not dramatic, not sudden, but unmistakably new. That afternoon, she asked me to stay for lunch. We cooked together nothing fancy, just a shared effort over a skillet and a few jokes about my lack of knife skills. At one point, while slicing tomatoes, she turned to me and said, "I used to believe I couldn't rebuild something meaningful in the same house where everything fell apart. But you being here, it's like the walls know something's changed. It wasn't just the house. She had changed. I had to." After we ate, she brought out a photo album, thick with time. "I think it's time I remember the good parts without fear of what followed," she said. We flipped through pages filled with vacations, Christmas mornings, inside jokes captured in Polaroid smiles, pointed out her favorite picture, a candid of her laughing in a garden, her late husband behind the camera. "He was the first person to make me feel seen," she said. "And you remind me I'm still worth being seen." I didn't try to compete with his memory. I knew better than to make this about erasing the past. It wasn't about being better, it was about being different. And that was more than enough that evening. After the sun dipped low and the day's weight had softened, Camila walked me to my truck. She looked tired but lighter, like some invisible burden had been set down, if only for the night. As I opened the door, she touched my arm. "Thank you," she said. "It's not just for today, but for not needing me to be fixed." I smiled, brushing my hand over hers. "You were never broken," I said. "Just someone learning to be whole in a different way." She didn't kiss me goodbye, but her smile lingered as I drove off, and that said everything. As I pulled into my driveway that night, the sky turning that deep violet that only happens in June, I sat in the truck for a moment, just breathing. I thought about how far we'd come since that first afternoon on her driveway, water splashing at my feet, her voice cracking as she said, "I'm 51 and don't know how to be alone." Now, she wasn't alone. Neither was I. We hadn't rushed anything, hadn't forced clarity where confusion still lingered. And yet we had found something unmistakably honest. I went inside, turned on the lamp in my small living room, and stared at the keys she had given me resting in the bowl near the door. I picked them up, felt their weight, and knew that some doors don't just lead into houses. Some open into new seasons of life, if you're brave enough to turn the lock. The following week rolled in with the kind of gentle rhythm that signaled something new had taken root between us. Something unspoken, but deeply felt. Camila and I didn't talk about defining what we were. Didn't label our connection, didn't pressure it to grow into anything faster than it wanted to. Undenial. The way his undada dada dada dada. Well and dada, and some was into someone else, was in summer, to send us, or send off, was all sestawide. Was all said were it all, prever at Waltery and it. There was a softness now in the way she looked at me, in the way her voice landed a little slower when she said my name. And there was a quiet gravity in the way I found myself checking my phone every morning, hoping to see her name there, even if it was just a photo of her coffee mug or a cloud formation she thought looked like a bird. One Thursday, I took a half-day off and drove back to her place without telling her in advance. I brought over a new hanging planter I'd built out of old cedar and some soil and herbs I picked up from the nursery in town. I knew she'd been wanting to start a small kitchen garden, and something about surprising her made the idea feel even better. When I pulled up, she was out back, sitting on the small bench by the olive tree, eyes closed, arms loose by her side, kind of meditative calm painted across her features. She heard my footsteps and turned, a brief flicker of surprise, lighting her face before it melted into a smile.
Oh, what's all this?
She asked, brushing her hair back from her face as she stood. I brought you a starter garden, I said, holding up the cedar planter like a trophy. Thyme basil, rosemary. Figured we could hang it near the kitchen window. She grinned, and without hesitating, wrapped her arms around me. It wasn't the kind of hug meant to say, hello, it was the kind meant to say, you were thought of. When she pulled back, her eyes were shiny, and I realized how much it meant to her, not just the gift, but the gesture. I hadn't just brought her herbs. I had brought her a little reminder that something could grow, again, in a place that had seen so much loss. We spent the afternoon installing it together, me handling the drilling and leveling while she filled the planter and ran her fingers through the soil like it was holy. There was laughter, especially when she got dirt on her nose and didn't notice, and a shared silence that filled the spaces between tasks like music. When we were done, we stood back and admired the work. The planter looked perfect, snug against the side of the house, the herbs already catching sunlight and dancing in the breeze. She stepped closer to me, leaned her head against my shoulder. This feels right, she said. Not used to that. Things rarely feel right without a catch. I took a breath, resting my cheek lightly against her hair. Not everything has to be a test, Camila. Sometimes it's just good. She turned to face me, her expression unreadable at first. What if I'm not ready for something serious, she asked. What if I'm still figuring myself out? What if I'm scared that I'll end up relying on you too much, like I did with him? I didn't flinch. I'd been waiting for this moment, not because I wanted it to come, but because I knew it would. The part where she'd start doubting? The joy she was starting to feel. I nodded, then spoke slowly. Then we stay in this moment. We don't rush it. We don't build a future on what-ifs. We build it on what is. And what this is you and me, sharing a Thursday afternoon, planting herbs, standing in the sunlight. That's enough for today. She blinked, then smiled through a tight throat. You always know how to say the exact thing I need to hear. I'm just saying what I mean, I replied. Later that evening, as we sipped tea on the porch and watched the sun bleed into the horizon, she brought up something she hadn't before. I've been writing again, she said. Journaling actual stories, fiction, but personal. Loosely based on my life, but not in a way that feels heavy. More like I'm letting things out that I didn't know were still in me. Right. I lit up at that. That's incredible. You always had a storyteller's soul, she shrugged, clearly flattered. Maybe. I think I forgot I had a voice. For years, everything I wrote felt like it was for someone else's eyes. It's like I was trying to make my pain digestible. But now, I don't know. I'm doing it for me. Maybe someday I'll share it with others. Maybe not. Either way, it's powerful, I said. It's you taking back your voice. That's more than enough. She looked at me then, long and slow, her gaze lingering like she was trying to memorize my face under that golden dusk light. "I don't say it enough," she whispered, "but I'm glad it was you on my driveway that day. I was so lost, so tired of pretending I was okay. And then there you were, power washing years of neglect from my concrete hand. From me, too, I think." I didn't respond with words. Instead, I reached over, took her hand in mine, and let the quiet say it all. We didn't need to define what this was. Not yet. Maybe not ever. What mattered was that it was real. And real things, I'd come to learn, don't always fit into neat categories. They grow where there's room. And we had made room for grief, for hope, for love in its own unrushed form. A few days later, she texted me a line from her newest story. She didn't need rescuing. She needed someone to hold the ladder while she climbed. I stared at that line for a long time, smiling to myself. Because that was it. That was us. No saving, no fixing. Just steady presence. Just choosing to show up. That night I dreamed of a garden full of lavender and thyme and wild things that didn't need pruning, just space and time to bloom. As July deepened and the heat settled in like a blanket draped over the whole town, Camila and I found a new rhythm that wasn't quite a relationship in the traditional sense, but couldn't be mistaken for anything casual either. We were caught in the warmth of something slow building and deeply familiar, as if we had known each other in a previous life and were only now remembering. I spent more time at her house not out of obligation, but because it started to feel like the center of my peace. The tools in my truck stayed packed, but they waited longer between jobs. My mornings started earlier so I could wrap up work by noon, giving us long afternoons with no agenda. There was something almost sacred about how mundane our time together had become. We'd spend evenings on her porch listening to records from a crate she hadn't opened in years, letting the crackle of old vinyl wash over us like a second breeze. Sometimes we'd take drives to nowhere, the windows down, her hair wild and free, her bare feet on the dashboard as she sang along to Fleetwood Mac or Tracy Chapman, and I'd catch myself smiling without even realizing it. There was no grand romance to point to, no declarations, but there was comfort, depth, ease. And in many ways, that felt more romantic than any flowers or champagne ever could. One Saturday, I noticed her old hammock was sagging, the fabric worn through from years of weather and quiet neglect. I mentioned it casually, and she responded with a half smile and a shrug, saying she hadn't used it in years anyway. Still, while she was out running errands the next morning, I replaced it. A new one, sturdy, weatherproof, the kind with thick rope and soft canvas, wide enough for two people to lie side by side. I installed it under the olive tree, where the light filtered through in patches and the air stayed cool even at midday. When she returned, she spotted it immediately. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at it, her hands slowly coming to her chest like she was grounding herself from emotion. Finally, she turned to me and whispered, "You keep bringing things back to life around here," I replied gently. "I think you were just waiting for someone to remind you how that afternoon we laid in the hammock together, swaying slowly, the breeze threading through the leaves above us, and for the first time, she rested her head on my chest and let herself fall asleep. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No kiss. Number. Confessions. Just trust. Just her breathing evening out in rhythm with mine. And in that moment, I knew without question that she was letting herself be safe, not because I'd asked her to, but because she had chosen to. Later that week, Camila told me she wanted to start volunteering at the local animal rescue again. She had stopped going a few years ago after her husband passed, saying the place had become too heavy with memory. But now she spoke of it with a kind of light in her voice, like the idea of offering care again didn't feel draining, it felt purposeful. I told her I thought it was beautiful, and I meant it. Watching her reclaim parts of herself she'd once packed away felt like watching spring bloom in real time. Still, not every day was simple. Grief has a long tail, and sometimes it swung back unexpectedly. There were mornings when she'd withdraw. Her energy quiet, her gaze distant. I learned not to crowd her, not to fix, but simply to stay. I'd make her coffee, leave it by her side, and sit with her in silence, letting her know I wasn't going anywhere. And slowly, she'd return. Sometimes with a touch on my arm, sometimes with a sigh that said thank you more clearly than words ever could. One night in particular lingered with me. We were sitting outside after dinner, the sky stitched with stars, a soft playlist humming from her phone speaker. She turned to me and asked, "Do you think it's possible to fall in love more than once in your life?" I looked at her and answered carefully, "I think love takes different shapes. What you had before, it mattered. It still matters. This isn't a replacement, it's something new. And yes, I think hearts can grow again. Maybe not the same way. Maybe deeper." She looked down at her lap, then back up at me. "I want to believe that. You don't have to believe it all at once," I said. "Just enough to keep showing up." That night she kissed me for the first time, not rushed, not dramatic. Just a soft, grateful thing. A thank you, a maybe, a beginning. Over the next few weeks, our routines quietly wrapped around each other's lives like ivy curling around a trellis. I fixed up the small shed in her backyard so she could turn it into a writing nook. She planted a few new beds of flowers in front of her house, and for the first time in years, kept them alive. We didn't move in together, didn't talk about the future in capital letters, but we shared dinners, weekends, music, and silence, and that felt like enough. One morning, while working on a client's fence across town, I got a text from her. "You've become part of my peace. Just thought you should know." I stared at that message for a while, the sun warming the back of my neck, and I thought this is what it means to be seen and not feared. To be loved without being needed to rescue. Simply walk alongside someone as they find their own way. I knew we still had miles to go. Healing is never a straight path, and love real lasting. Love isn't a destination, but a practice. But I also knew, without a doubt, that I wanted to keep practicing. That I wanted to keep choosing her every day. Not in grand gestures, but in the little things. In power washing driveways and planting herbs. In quiet mornings and unspoken understandings. And perhaps the most beautiful part of it all was this. She wanted to choose me back, not because she needed someone to fix her broken parts, because she finally believed she could be loved with all of them showing. The seasons began to change again, and with them, so did we. The blistering heat of summer gave way to the mellow golds of early autumn, and Camila's olive tree began to drop small fruit onto the soil like quiet blessings. She had taken to spending her mornings in the hammock. Writing in a leather-bound journal she kept tucked under her arm like a lifeline. I never asked what she wrote, never peeked, never even joked about it, because I knew whatever lived inside those pages was hers, and the trust it took just to sit beside her while she penned them felt like its own kind of intimacy. We never had the big talk, no dramatic speech, no labels, no candlelit dinners where one of us said, "So what are we?" It just became understood. I was hers, and she was mine, in the way people belong to each other, not through possession, but through presence. She no longer spoke about being afraid of being alone. It's not because the fear had vanished, but because it had softened, reshaped into something manageable. Like background noise she could tune out when she was near me. I remember the morning she said she wanted to take a trip. Nothing extravagant, just a weekend up the coast by the sea. She told me she hadn't done anything spontaneous in years, hadn't packed a bag just for the sake of chasing a sunrise. We drove out on a Friday, the truck packed with mismatched duffel bags and a thermos of her favorite mint tea. Out she played, old jazz standards on her phone. We talked about everything and nothing, our favorite meals growing up. The strangest jobs we'd ever had, dreams we never admitted out loud. I told her I'd always wanted to learn how to play the piano, but never had the discipline. She laughed and said she once got suspended in high school for sneaking a cat into class. We laughed until we cried, until the road blurred under the weight of shared joy. The cabin we stayed in wasn't much to rooms, and a balcony overlooking the ocean, but it was enough. That first night, she stood out on the deck, wrapped in a sweater 3 sizes too big, her hair catching the breeze like seaweed in water. I stood behind her, arms gently circling her waist, and we just stared into the distance, letting the sound of waves fill the space between us. After a long silence, she said, "You know, I think I'm learning how to be alone. But not because I need to be anymore. It's because I finally feel safe enough to not fear it." I didn't reply, just tightened my arms a bit and kissed the top of her head. The next morning, I woke to find her gone from bed. A little panic flickered in my chest until I saw her note down by the water. I threw on a hoodie and found her barefoot on the beach, her jeans rolled up, letting the cold tide wash over her ankles. She was smiling at the sky, watching. Seagulls wheel overhead. I walked up beside her, took her hand without saying a word. We watched the sunrise together, the light cracking open the horizon like a secret. Later, she handed me a folded sheet of paper. "It's not finished," she said, "but it's something I wrote for you." I unfolded it slowly. It was a short story, fictional, but only just, about a woman who'd lost too much, and a man who showed up with a power washer and unknowingly started washing away her grief. The ending wasn't about them falling in love. It was about the woman standing on her own again, not because the man had saved her, but because he had held space for her to do it herself. It was one of the most beautiful things I'd ever read. We drove back home that Sunday evening with the windows down, hands intertwined on the center console, saying nothing and everything all at once. Back at her house, she invited me in without asking. We made soup, watched an old film on her projector, and fell asleep on the couch. Limbs tangled, hearts steady. There were no walls left, no performance. It's just two people content in their imperfect. Ordinary closeness. As winter approached, she surprised me again. She invited me to spend Christmas with her family. I knew that was a big step, meant she was letting the people who had known her through her heartbreak now see her in her healing. That she wasn't hiding me or this anymore. The day before we left for her sister's place, I caught her sitting at the dining table, staring at a framed photo of her late husband. I watched her for a while before walking over. She looked up, her eyes soft. "I still miss him," she whispered. "I'd be worried if you didn't," I said. She reached out and touched my face. "Thank you for never making me choose." "You don't have to," I said. "There's room for both." We spent the holidays in a blur of noise, laughter, kids running underfoot, and endless slices of pie. Her family welcomed me with cautious curiosity at first, but by day 2, I was being handed beers and roped into board games. I caught Camila watching me from across the room one evening, her expression unreadable, a mix of nostalgia and something stronger, something like peace. Later that night, she leaned into me and said, "I never thought I'd feel this again." "You deserve to," I replied. The night before New Year's, she brought out a box of old decorations from the attic, things she hadn't touched in years. We put up garlands, twinkle lights, and even the ridiculous ceramic snowman she swore she hated. At midnight, we toasted with warm cider. She didn't make a resolution. She said she was already living it. On January 2nd, I returned to a project I'd been putting off, finally power washing my own driveway. As I watched the dirt and grime lift off the concrete, I smiled, remembering how all of this had started. One call, one job. One woman who stood at the edge of her grief and asked, "How do I do this alone?" Oh. And now, here we were, still figuring it out together. She didn't need rescuing. She needed someone who'd stay. Kind of love we all deserve, not the one that fixes us, but the one that simply walks beside us until we remember we were never broken at all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.